Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. And this week, I want to talk about this something strange that has shown up at each of our doorsteps in recent weeks, and that is a phone book. Uh, some people were wondering why it still shows up at our doorsteps and why they still even print one. And a lot of folks have been talking about it so much that actually WKBW Channel 7 did a report about the need for a phone book. And so that got us to thinking, and a lot of people on their report were thinking it was silly, a waste of paper. Because today, what do we do when we need a phone number? We just Google it and or look up whitepages.com or things like that. And it seems silly to have a book that printed out book that has all the phone numbers in it. And secondly, it does seem like a waste of paper, and how many of us just throw it out? And it'd be interesting to hear how many of you actually keep your phone book. I do know a couple people who actually look forward to it and put it right next to their phone, but I think most of us don't hold on to them. In fact, the one that I received here at my house, I took right to my office because we actually keep them in the historian's office. And I'm going to talk about why. So phone books might have seem a bit out of date and not as important today, and completely irrelevant actually to some people in today's modern era when we can just look things up on the internet. But from a standpoint of history, phone books are a huge historical resource. And in the historian's office or any archive you go to, there will be hopefully, but in most cases, a large collection of telephone directories, but just directories in general, and to find out where people lived, and what their phone number was if you care about that. But there's a lot more information in these old phone directories that we often don't recognize. So you can find additional information about people besides their address and phone numbers, which is what we're used to today in the phone books that we have today. Now, the phone books have obviously gotten a lot smaller, and it's so much so that the phone book here, the white pages section, is almost non-existent because most people have cell phones. And the yellow pages section is the biggest part of it. But even still, it is very thin. And we were used to those really thick phone books for Southern Erie County. The Lions Club here in East Aurora was a fundraiser for decades for them to put a local directory together, and companies would buy advertising in it, and it would be a resource to look up services, contractors, and your friend down the street if you forgot their phone number. Today we have them all in our cell phones, and a lot of businesses just advertise on the internet, social media, the local newspaper, but a lot still do use the yellow pages as a way to advertise their business. But um, I don't need to tell you that the phone directory has gone out of style. But in the early days of even before telephones, the local directory was a very important document, was a very important book. And different organizations would publish them. And going even back into the 1800s, you'll find city directories, or village directories, rural directories that will tell you who lived in certain places, and where they lived, and a little bit of additional information. Uh, so in the early days, they were directories. So people didn't have to actually have a phone in order to be in the quote unquote phone book. It would just be a village directory. We actually had one, several here in East Aurora. Uh, City of Buffalo would publish directories, and if you're looking for any information about those, places like the library, downtown library, or the Buffalo History Museum archives, but any historical society or local historian's office, that would be a place to go look for phone books. Um, in the early days, once they started getting phone companies would publish the actual directory, and they would actually make a big deal out of it. And businesses would want to be in the phone directory, so they would buy advertising, and it was a very important way to get their name out there. The problem is in the early days there were no um, there were fewer regulations over utilities. So there were in some cases two or three phone companies operating in the same place. So here in East Aurora, at one point we could have two, or I'm not sure if we had three, but we had at least two phone companies operating at the same time, and they each published their own phone book. So if you were trying to make a phone call back then, in addition to having to call from, you sometimes couldn't call from one person to another because they had different phone companies, or in order to transfer from one phone company to the other, you had to pay extra, a toll, even if that person just lived down the street. But they also put out two different phone books. So you'll have the Bell Company phone book and another company. There were different companies with different names, and they went out of business or merged into the New York Telephone Company or the Bell Telephone Company. So you'll see these different phone companies, and so they had different phone books. So if you see an old phone book and you don't find somebody in it, it doesn't mean they didn't live there. It could mean that they just didn't have the phone, they didn't subscribe to the phone company that that book was published from. So that makes it even more complicated. So you have to have multiple directories to get a sense of who lived in the community. Then they started having franchises, and the local government would have a franchise for one company, and there would be one telephone company, and then they started publishing a phone directory, and you could be pretty confident that if the person at least had a phone, they'd be in that directory. And as we got into the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, more and more people were getting telephones. So before the telephone became popular, and even as the phone started coming along, there would be companies that would put out a village directory or a town directory, and that would include everyone's name or a majority of the people's names, regardless if they had a telephone. Then we got into a period of time where you had to have a phone to really be in the phone directory. Uh, Businesses in town would actually, with the two separate phone companies at one point, would advertise that they had both phones. And it was actually it was a convenience for your customers to be able to call you on either phone, and regardless of which one your customers subscribe to. So really complicated a way of doing things back when there was less regulation over phone companies, and part of that confusion was multiple phone directories. What was really great about phone directories, starting about the 1920s, late 1920s, going into the probably 1960s, is the information that was included. In more modern days, the phone book that I remember as a kid, and even more modern ones, was only the name of the subscriber would be in the phone books. Usually, the man of the house would be listed in the phone book with the phone number and maybe the address. Sometimes you could take the address out, so you'd get the name, address, and phone number of somebody in the phone directory. But 1927's phone book, 1941's phone book, even into the 1960s. These are just ones I'm familiar with here from East Aurora, but this would apply to any community. Included not only the name of the subscriber, the person who actually paid the phone bill and the phone bill's name was in, but their spouse, children's names, the occupations of each of those people. So that, for instance, the 1927 phone book lists where you worked. So this was helpful. Fellow researcher, Mike Kelly, who researched the local lore history cartoons that were published in the local newspaper, the Easter Advertiser, for several years. He actually went into I think it was 1927, might have been a little earlier. He wanted to know where all the Roycrofters lived. Well, what was great about that phone book is it listed people as Roycrofters, or their employer as the Roycroft. So he just went through, took their addresses, and plotted them out on a map to kind of show how much the Roycroft was influencing the local labor market, how many people were employed by the Roycroft here in the village of East Aurora. So using that information of occupations within that phone book was quite useful for that research. So occupations. And then it would also have home and business address, so you could cross-reference. So it'd say Mr. Smith was an engineer. He lives at this house, but he works here. So a lot of information packed into one entry in a phone directory, which was quite useful. We don't have that today. Over time, it just became name, address, and phone number. So there's some very useful information in old phone books. It was very interesting when the 1940 census came out. Everyone was really excited because it was the first census that included exact addresses and more information about people. And there was some great excitement about that census. And I thought, well, I kind of laughed a little bit because we have a 1941 phone directory in the archives of the town historian's office, and a lot of places have early 1940s phone directories that included the information that was in the census that everybody was excited about that was being released, because they wait several years. I think it's 50 years, maybe more, for the census to release all the information. Um, and people were excited about it, but we already had that information in the phone directory, which was quite interesting because they included it all in there. Some information, not they don't have your age in the phone directory, but occupations and who was living in the household, they had that in there. Not all minor children were included, but to know the spouse names and their occupation was quite useful. Another great thing about the old phone books was they had two separate sections many times. They had your listing, alphabetical listing by name of the people, and then up until the 1960s, maybe into the 1970s, they also had a second section by street. So you could go down each street name and then each number of the house or business and find out who was there at the time. This has been incredibly useful because we could tell where certain businesses were, what their locations were at a given time. This actually was quite useful most recently. I think it was the 1927 phone directory. I'm currently working on some research about the Larkin economy stores, the grocery stores that were all over Western New York, but particularly here in East Aurora. We actually had three of them at least at one time at each section of the town. So I just needed to confirm where they were, and that phone directory was very helpful. And that article story about Larkin stores will be coming out soon, so stay tuned about that. But the phone book was very helpful in confirming where these stores were at a given time. So those cross references. So if you wanted to find out who lived in your house, you wouldn't have to know their name. You could just go down, you know, 260 Main Street. I'm making that up, but 260 Main Street and find out who lived there in 1941, 1927. You could go through and find out who lived in your house. This is helpful too because a lot of times property records only indicate who owned the property, and phone directories will tell you who lived there. So if someone was renting or a business was there that was renting and didn't own the building, it wouldn't necessarily be in the property record or the search and title records, but it would be in the phone book, which is kind of quite interesting to have those cross references. Some other information that's been included in phone books gives you an idea of the culture at the time, and even the racism of the time. So I years ago was doing a research into Mary Taylor, who was we think the first student of color, black student to graduate from East Aurora High School. And I was researching her, trying to figure out where she lived, who her family was, and there was a listing in the 1901 directory, not phone book, but the village directory, for a Reuben Taylor, who I believe was her dad, her father, and he was the only one listed in the phone directory with a COL next to his name, short for colored, person of color. And they used that racist term that we would consider racist today to denote that he was a black man. No one else's race was included in the phone book, but if you were looking him up to call on him to find him, you would know before you got there that he was a black man. But of course, that information wasn't deemed necessary for people of other races. So that gives you a sense of the racism that was happening at the time, that he was being denoted by his race, but nobody else was. It also helps us get a sense of how few people of color were living in East Aurora at the time, and I believe um, he's the only one listed with COL next to his name at the time. And for a lot of historical publications have said the Taylors were one of very few black families living in East Aurora at the time. But he was the only one I could find listed with an address in the directory. So that's helpful in trying to figure out the culture of our community and the racism of the community and the race relations of our community. And he has a Reuben Taylor, and he was a horse trainer. I believe it was at uh, one of the horse farms here in town. Through the census and the phone direct or the village directory information, I was able to piece together the story of their family. The directory itself became a really important resource to give me a sense of what their community was like, and probably being, if not the only one of very few black families here in our community at the time. An interesting aspect of phone directories and phone books. Early phone directories actually had hardcovers, which is kind of interesting, and then they started doing covers. And what you would do, and there were a lot of notices in the paper when they were publishing new phone directories. It was a big deal. The company that published them would come out with articles and advertising saying the phone directories, the due date for replacing your ads in it is coming up, and don't miss out. And they would put one out every 1 or 2 years. And this is a perfect way to get your name out there. Well, today this phone directory just got plopped on my front porch. But back then they would actually recycle the phone directories. So you would actually go somewhere to get it, and people did this because the phone directory was such an important resource. So it was like, you had to go sign up for the internet. You wanted all this information, you would actually go, but you had to bring your own phone, your old phone directory, and trade it in, and they would give you the new phone directory because they would recycle the old ones. They'd mulch them down. What's interesting from a historical perspective about that, and there's a great, if anyone remembers the old 1950s TV show, Dennis the Menace. There's actually a great episode where Dennis gets himself into trouble, where there's Mr. Wilson's phone directory gets recycled, taken to the recycling plant with an important piece of paper stuck inside, and he thought that it would be there for safekeeping. They were recycling the old one, and he got the new one, and Dennis got involved with it. But that little episode shows what they actually did. That actually did happen. And there were actually notices in the Easter Advertiser and the local newspapers about how to get your new phone book when they came out. Bring your old phone book for recycling and you'll get the new one. What makes that interesting historically, though, is phone books are hard to come by, right? People didn't save them. You didn't have an old phone book that you would just put in your closet or in a drawer somewhere, and then 50 years later we find it as a great historical resource. You had to purposely save the phone book, and that didn't happen very often because you many times couldn't get the new one until you gave up the old one. So a lot of they're rare because of that fact, because we recycled them. So that's a very interesting part of the phone book history, and so we're lucky to have the ones that we do have. So the question is today, since we use Google so much to do what we used to do with phone books, is are we losing that history? And I'll leave that question to you. I think we are, because the internet, when you go online to look up a person's name or a business address or their hours, it's not static. It's not permanent. They can change websites. Yeah, there are certain ways we can preserve old websites, but will the information that's now contained on the internet that used to be contained in a hard format, is that going to be saved for future research? Will we know where people lived 100 years from now? It's hard to know whether these things will be preserved. Historians are talking about it, about how to preserve that information. One thing that we do have that seems consistent is government records. So tax records will be kept, property records are kept. We know who owned property, and those records are kept the same way they have been all along. But it will be interesting to see how these phone book records will be kept. And but the other interesting part of that is even if we did have listings for people who now have cell phones that used to have home landlines that would be included in a phone book, it does not include all the great information that we used to have: person's occupation, spouses' names, children's names. So would it even be worth it to have it in the phone book, or have a phone book if that information's not in it anyway? But the internet information, we can find out a lot about people from the past, um, but will we be able to find out that information as easily? I don't know. Are we going to be preserving? Will there be other ways to find information? I think perhaps there will be. Government records, will LinkedIn pages be saved? All those information about people that we rely on, obituaries and telephone directories to find out today about people from the past. It will be interesting how people in 100 years will be looking us up and finding out information about us. And I don't think the phone book, the directory, will be part of that. So that's just an interesting way um, of how history has changed over time. Something that was so important to the community and to communication even just 50 years ago is now being considered by many people as a waste of paper when it's being plopped on our front porch. So I just find it interesting that people actually the phone book was so important that people would actually go somewhere to pick one up to get it. It wasn't delivered; you had to go somewhere to pick it up. And today, people are complaining that it's even delivered. So I'll put that little report. We'll put a link to that Channel 7 report. It was interesting what people had to say about the phone book. I thought it was kind of neat, and that's what's kind of um, spurred the discussion today. So I'll put that in the comments if you want to watch their report on it. Again, thanks for joining me. It's been great hearing your comments and suggestions. Keep them coming. Again, I'm Rob Goller. I'm the Town and Village Historian, but these videos that I do and a lot of the research I do are done separately from my position as Town and Village Historian. So anything I say or put out there in these videos are my words alone and don't represent my position as the Town and Village Historian. Again, thanks for joining me. Thanks for keeping history alive. And please like and share and tell people about these videos. I'd love to have more people joining us. It's been great so far. More and more people are watching and giving me feedback, and I appreciate that. And let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what kind of topics you want to hear. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.